The last thing to discuss in terms of a supply chain is how to manage supply chain. In today's business world, supply chain plays more and more important role, since specialization is the trend of modern industry, which brings the higher efficiency in operations. In the past, vertical integration is the typical way the firms did business. It means the firm tries to process everything from raw materials to retail selling all by itself. In such a setting, the firm does not need to worry about the external relationship, and the internal operation is sufficient. But specialization requires the coordination and the support from the other companies to complete the product or service to the customers. Different companies usually have conflict interests. Hence, how to maintain a long-term relationship to coordinate participators of the supply chain becomes very critical. That is what we want to achieve when managing supply chain. Supply chain management emphasizes the strategic coordination, not only within an organization, but also among all the parties in the supply chain. The goal of supply chain management is to match supply to demand as efficiently as possible. Notice that supply chain is basically a linked process throughout all the parties involved in providing the products or services to the end customers. Hence, we can actually view the supply chain management as to synchronize a firm's process with all of those of its suppliers and customers. This is the process view of supply chain management. Hence, we can summarize the two focuses of supply chain management as we have summarized for the operations management. Focus 1 is to match supply to demand, but it needs to be done through the whole supply chain. Focus 2 is to deal with all kinds of uncertainties in the supply chain, which is called the supply chain risk. To match supply to demand, the key issues are listed here. We must determine how many to outsource and how many to make in-house. Based on that, we need to manage how to buy, how to maintain a stable and trustable relationship with both suppliers and customers. Hence, we can summarize the three basic components to manage in the supply chain. First is the procurement, including something like the strategic sourcing and the supplier management. This is actually about how to get stuff. Second is the logistics. The interesting topics include traffic management, reverse logistics, third-party logistics, and RFID, etc. This is about how to move stuffs. The last important component is inventory management, which is about how to keep stuffs One of the intricate issues here is the bullwhip effect. Bullwhip effect shows how the inventory fluctuation is enlarged through the supply chain. This is a demo of it. The inventory fluctuation seen by the initial supplier is much larger than that seen by the final customer. It is caused by variation in demand. Consistent to the inventory oscillation, the demand faced by the initial supplier has much larger variation than final demand from the final customer. The bullwhip effect is magnified by a lot of different factors, and it makes the supply chain suffer from higher costs and lower customer satisfaction. Here are some strategies typically used to mitigate the bullwhip effect. Especially useful one is the VMI, the Vendor Managed Inventory. This is based on the coordination between the supplier and the buyer. Now, if a company relies on another party to fulfill some of its function, such as a supplier in China to produce a critical part, then this company must be subject to risks associated with the other party's operations disruption. Also, all the risks associated with the transportation and the transaction, such as natural disaster and exchange risk, that company will also prepare for them. If a company wants to avoid all the risks related to its supply chain, it's only one way. It has to produce everything in-house, which is not practical or too costly. Every company should focus more on its core competency. Hence, every company needs to make a trade-off between cost reduction and supply chain risk management. To manage supply chain risk, we must be able to quickly identify problems and respond to them. Here is the formal definition of a supply chain risk. It is the likelihood of a disruption that would impact the ability of a company to continuously supply products or services. But the probably more important information is how supply chain risks are generally categorized. There are two types of supply chain risk: coordination risks and disruption risks. Coordination risks are those uncertainties associated with the day-to-day operations. These risks can often be measured by statistical method, summarized by statistical distribution. Accordingly, there are well-established tools and methods to manage these risks. The success key for managing coordination risks is to obtain sufficient information about the operations of every party in the supply chain. In other words, we need to improve the supply chain visibility. On the contrary, since disruption risks are caused by natural or man-made disasters, which are something unpredictable. The corresponding success key is to develop event response capability. Now, let me give you some examples of disruption risks. 2011, Japanese earthquake and tsunami. The picture shows cargo containers are strewn about in Sendai, northern Japan. It's Saturday, March 12, 2011. It caused very severe effects on global auto supply chain. Toyota suffered from the shortage of over 150 parts, leaving Toyota North American operating at 30% of capacity. GM immediately closed its Shreveport, LA plant after the earthquake because of an immediate shortage of mass airflow sensors made by Hitachi. This picture is 2010, French pension reform strike. French unions stopped fuel productions at 12 refineries of the nation. It resulted in a sudden increase of fuel import due to short of domestic supply. It in turn led to the crude oil prices drops, which then resulted in a soar of the global logistical costs. This one is 2011 riots broke out at Foxconn's Taiyuan plant, while Apple's iPhone 5 was made. It results in a shutdown of this plant, which has 79,000 employees. This riot was triggered by wage disruption, wage disputes, and labor conditions. Both Apple and Foxconn refused to reveal the effect of this riot on Apple's iPhone 5 supply. But we know that not only Apple's supplies is influenced. Apple also faced harsh critics from the American consumers and the politicians for working with the devil. Okay, so all these examples, in summary, we can see disruption risk may have very little chance to happen, but once happened, it usually causes very severe consequences. Now, let's conclude how we can manage the supply chain coordination risks and disruption risks. Here is the framework you should rely on. First is to identify the sources of potential disruption. Then we need to assess the potential impact of the risk. It means we need to get an evaluation about how severe the consequence of this risk could be, and which part of our operations will be affected by the something bad happened. Finally, we must develop plans to mitigate the risk. There are 3 strategies to develop the plans: risk avoidance, risk reduction, and risk sharing. These strategies can be hybridized and used together. The table here gives some risk mitigation strategy corresponding to different sources of the supply chain risk. So as you can see, if the risk is mainly from natural disaster, the usual strategy is contingency planning and insurance, which helps reduce and share the risk. If it is a country risk, so we need to do something like hedging currency. It can help to reduce the risk. And producing locally can help to avoid country risk. If you are worrying about the supplier failures, then the firm can try to source from multiple suppliers so as to sharing the risk. So if it is for logistics failure, then we typically will keep safety stocks and the detailed tracking also help to reduce the risk. And the alternate suppliers can help to share the risk.